Well, good day, everyone. Certainly wonderful to join you today. It is Friday, the 29th of May, 2020. It is noon, so it must be time for our daily dose of Pinellas Park, as we like to say, daily dose of Bible, and a daily dose of hopefully some encouraging words for you. Indeed, we are living in tumultuous times. Not only do we have the whole coronavirus and the reopening of that, but then it seems as if some parts of our country are just on fire, literally so, and certainly in a very metaphorical way as well, as once again we found that there has been a conflict that has been kind of blown up in Minneapolis and St. Paul and those areas over some of the racial matters and racial tensions that are going on there. Millions of lost dollars in revenue as businesses are being looted. And of course, that all stems from a man by the name of George Floyd being killed by a police officer. And it looks very incriminating from the video that you can see online. Just a tragic situation all around. But, tragedy has always existed, and there's always been a call for Christians to be brave and to live lives that don't necessarily rise above those situations, but certainly are not defined by them, but instead are defined by who we are as we find our identity in Christ. I want to read today from the book of Philippians. We're probably going to kind of close the book on the book of Philippians for now and go beginning Monday to another book or to some other topic or something along that line as we strive to give you words that encourage. But I believe Paul says something here that is pertinent to our day and age and the times in which we live. Verse 27, chapter 1, book of Philippians, and a few verses that follow. Only let your manner of life be worthy of the gospel of Christ, so that whether I come and see you or am absent, I may hear of you, that you are standing firm in one spirit and in one mind, striving side by side for the faith of the gospel, and not frightened in anything by your opponents. This is a clear sign to them that of their destruction, but of your salvation, and that from God. For it has been granted to you that for the sake of Christ you should not only believe in him, but also suffer his sake. Engage in the same conflict that you saw I had, and now hear that I still have. There are several things that Paul mentions here, and I'm just going to mention two or three of them by, again, word or by way of, or attempting to encourage us in this day about some of the things that maybe are not sitting on top of us here in a very personal way, but certainly are part of the fabric of our country in which we live and have to move and operate and try to spread the message of Christ, try to be that light in the world, try to go out and be the salt of the earth. These are some of the things that we face. Number one, Paul says, no matter what's going on, no matter what your situation, whether you're being persecuted, always act in a manner that is worthy of the gospel. Now, if you're reading the King James Version here, it says, only let your conversation be as becometh the gospel of Christ. It's just kind of an old way of saying the same thing. Your life should be defined by its identity in Christ. And not only that, everything that we do ought to be done with the idea of we are worthy of the message, the good news of Christ. Well, what is the good news of Christ? Well, that, he came, he suffered, he died on the cross, went to a tomb, and he rose again. Well, how could I ever be worthy of that? Well, it's not as if Paul's saying, look, you're earning this. But what he's saying is, look, you ought to walk in this life circumspectly, considering that sacrifice, that good news of the gospel, and then walk accordingly. Walk as if you were desiring to be worthy of that sacrifice that has been made, for you. And we encourage people to do this all the time, and in a physical sense. We talk about Memorial Day we just had not long ago, and we ought to live lives that appreciate appreciate and pay homage to the sacrifices of those who went before us and, have held our freedom and have captured that, for us. We talk about it when it comes to this whole virus situation and, those who are working on, the front lines and making that sacrifice, and some of them getting sick and some of them even dying, to try to help stem the tide of this virus, spreading. We ought to live as if we appreciate and we are worthy of, that sacrifice that they are making, for us. But the second thing I think he says is very simply this: we ought to act without fear, right? We ought to demonstrate, because we are Christians, because God is at our back, because we have that good news, because Christ died for us, and he rose again so that we can have that newness in life, not just here, but when this life is done. Because those things are all the case, then we ought not be frightened in anything. If you're reading the English Standard Version, that's what it says. It says, not frightened in anything. The King James here says, and in nothing terrified, right? And that word translated as, frightened in the ESV, and terrified in the excuse me, King James, essentially means, the same thing, right? We ought not be, stirred to this overwhelming emotion of fear, or a fear that grips us and keeps us from acting in ways that we should, in this world. Frightened by nothing, right? Certainly not our opponents, certainly not our adversaries, certainly not those things that malign or are against, Christianity. See, it's all for us. It's all for us to, our mission is for us to go out and teach the gospel, to proclaim, the message. And some that creates a real fear. How people are going to react. Are they going to, do negative things? Are they going to, harm us? I mean, that's a legitimate question. I mean, that does happen in the world even today. Not in our country per se, but indeed it does happen in, our country. Even though there is persecution, it just happens in kind of a less physical way. But, are we being fearless? Are we being, frightened by those in the world who would keep us from, spreading that, good news, right? Notice he goes on, he says, not frightened in anything by your opponents. This is a clear sign to them of their destruction, but of your salvation, and that from God. Now, it's interesting that Paul says this. He basically says, look, when you act without fear, when you are the brave, Christian, walking worthy of the sacrifice that Christ made in his death, burial, and excuse me, I've been battling allergies all week. But if we are truly being, brave and speaking that message and all of that, if we are standing up to, our adversaries, then it should be a clear sign to them that of their destruction. In the sense that, when God empowers us, and when they see us standing up and being brave, then they are seeing the power of God. They are seeing the strength of God and the sacrifice and the sacrifice that we are willing to make of overcoming that fear. And then the final thing is Paul says, look, sometimes you just have to accept the suffering, right? For it is granted to you that for the sake of Christ you should not only believe in him, but also suffer for his sake. Sometimes that happens. Sometimes because we live in the world that we live in, there is very simply pain and suffering. Because we, live with people who are of a different, set of beliefs than we are, there will be persecution, right? So no matter what Paul is, no matter what our situation might be, Paul is bringing out really three different nuances of what it means to be, a brave child of God. And to speak words that are, right, and to teach things that are correct in difficult situations like the ones we currently find our nation in, right? So we have to walk each day as we are worthy of that calling. We have to, rise in the face of opposition and still perform that mission. And then finally, sometimes we just have to accept that suffering is just part of, the walk that we are called to. Well, hopefully these are encouraging words to you. And I know that it might sound kind of odd because you're thinking, well, wait a minute, that really wasn't all that positive. But I think it is, because ultimately it is God that is going to enable our walk. He is going to enable our bravery, and He will enable us to overcome that conflict. With God, all things are possible. And we ought to rejoice in that fact and know that indeed God has us. I appreciate everybody coming out today. This has been your Daily Dose.